All right, so welcome to this short video on bonds. And this video has two parts. First, we're going to review the financial system as a whole and what it does and what this unit of finance is about. And then we're going to ask, how do bonds relate to finance? How do bonds fit into all this? And it might seem like a dumb question at first. We've been studying bonds for probably about half the time we've focused on finance. We've been studying bonds in some way. So it should seem obvious how they fit in, but what we found is historically students are often confused about sort of the big picture on bonds because it's easy to focus a lot on what looks complicated, like all the equations and whatnot, when you're focusing on bonds and kind of lose the big picture. So that's our goal, fitting bonds into the big picture of finance. So let's get to start with the review. Our financial system we have here connects savers to borrowers, and in particular, it's going to be kind of channeling funds from savers to borrowers and then from borrowers back to savers. And we call this process of channeling the funds between these two groups financial intermediation. And that is a term you need to know. It's like in bold print in the finance chapter. So it's definitely an essential term. So the basic process is going to be savers have some money. They send that money to the financial system. A simple example would be that you work a summer job, you have some money left over, you put it in the bank. The bank is a financial institution, so it's part of the financial system. So now they have your money, and what they will typically do is, in some way or some form, they will lend that money to borrowers. And for the case that we really care about, since we're talking a lot about businesses and funding investment and so on from our previous chapter, we'll think of this as the borrower's a business. They need $1 million to open up a new store or do some research and development, develop a new product. So the borrower gets that money, they do the R&D, hopefully it's successful, they get the new product out on the market, they're selling it, now they're making lots of money. And that's good because when you borrow a lot of money from the bank, you're going to eventually have to owe some kind of repayment back. So then money's going to flow from the borrower to the bank or to the financial system, some kind of financial institution with repayments. Then the financial system will take an inordinate amount of that repayment and siphon it off for itself and use it to pay out, big salaries and big bonuses to all the Harvard students working at the bank. That could be you one day. Hopefully you will feel bad about it. And then some small leftover crumbs will go back then to the saver who earns returns on his savings. So that will be our student we mentioned earlier. That could be you getting 0.1% interest or whatever on your savings at the bank. So some tiny returns here. And that's basically the ideal of how the financial system works, simplifying a lot of complex inner workings of this financial system where that all goes in the box, and what we see is the flow of funds. The important thing is the flow of funds. It is savers save money, that money gets lent to borrowers, borrowers make repayments, and then eventually some of that money and repayment gets to the savers. So bonds have to fit into this structure somehow. Bonds, and the answer of how bonds fit in is that basically they're a way of structuring this step, the lending step, and the repayment step, I guess. So they're a way of structuring how the funds are lent out and how funds, especially how funds are repaid. So let's go ahead and do some analogies, fill in some blanks below here, and hopefully that will clarify sort of the role bonds play. So we have fill in the blank, and I'm going to go ahead and fill in the second blank here. Blank bonds, either buying or selling, is like borrowing with a loan. We said bonds structure the process of lending money and then the repayments of that money. So either buying the bonds has to be like being a borrower and taking out a loan, or selling the bonds is like being a borrower and taking out the loan. And what I want you to do is pause the video and ask yourself, which one fits in? Is it buying bonds or selling bonds that's like taking out a loan? And don't be shy. Go ahead, pause the video, because you'll remember this much better. You'll remember it much better if you've already made up your mind and sort of the logic here. All right, so by now everyone's made up their mind. It's selling bonds that is like borrowing. And the idea is that if I'm trying to, so say before our example was that business needed $1 million to do R&D. It needed $1 million today to spend on R&D. it needs the money now. So if it bought bonds, it would be giving up funds, giving that money to someone else, and then that someone else would owe them money in the future. That's totally backwards from what we want. So it's by selling bonds today, that business sells a bunch of bonds, let's say 1,000 bonds for $1,000 each. That would give them $1 million in money today that they made from the sale that they can then use to do the R&D. The catch, of course, is that then they're going to owe coupons and the face value and so on in the future, so they're going to have to make repayments. So by selling bonds, that's analogous to taking out a loan. You get money today, you owe money in the future. And the bonds now are basically a way of structuring that process, just like a loan typically would structure the process of who repays who, when, how much, and so on. But before we get to that, talking about that, I want to talk about briefly if you had a loan, you would kind of know how much interest you're paying, what your financing cost was by just looking at the interest rate. That would be the main thing that you'd need to know how expensive it was to borrow this money. Well, bonds should have something similar, right? If you're borrowing by selling $1 million of bonds, you'd like to know, well, am I paying a lot in interest? Am I paying a little in interest? There should be like a one-number summary of that, just like interest rate does for loans. And fortunately, there is. That's the whole purpose of the yield. So we talk a lot about yield, and maybe that got lost in the thicket. But yield is really, its main purpose is to just summarize your borrowing cost, the same way an interest rate does. So yield is to bond as interest rate is to loan. And at that point, you could stop watching this video, and that pretty much captures the essentials of like how bonds fit into the financial system. They structure this borrowing and lending, this borrowing and repayment process, lending and repayment process, with the coupons and the face value and so on. But you understand the big picture, which is that you sell bonds to borrow, and your yield summarizes your borrowing cost, your financing costs. The last thing we could talk about is filling in with bonds, what are your givens and what do you have to solve for? With a loan, what are your givens and what do you have to solve for? And we'll see there's sort of a duality here. There's always going to be something that is left unsaid that you have to do a lot of calculations to figure out. In the case of bonds, the thing that you have to do a lot of calculating to find is the yield. For loans, it's going to be how much you actually make in terms of a monthly payment. So let's just list that out quickly here. With bonds, when you sell the bonds, the given that's fixed is going to be you sold it at a certain price. So I'll put PB down here. Like we said we sold those 1,000 bonds each for $1,000 each. There's a coupon that was fixed. There's a face value that was fixed. They have some maturity that's fixed. All of these would be given, and then you'd have to set up an equation and solve for the yield, which we denote I. With a loan, on the other hand, you wouldn't have to solve for the interest rate that's analogous to the yield. That would just be given. So interest rate would be given. Also, the length of the loan would be given. That's like the maturity for a bond. The size of the loan would be given. That's a lot like the price of the bond, although that gets beyond the analogy I want to do. But what you wouldn't know when you take out a loan, unless someone got out a calculator and then used these givens to calculate it, is what is your monthly payment or annual payment. So the last question we could ask is, why do people bother with bonds? Why don't we just use loans? The answer is, with loans, it's really hard to figure out, or it's a pain to figure out how much you're going to pay each month. With bonds, it's really simple. Your annual payment is one coupon of C times F dollars until the last year where you also have to pay the face value. The downside is that you'd have to solve implicitly for the yield, your borrowing cost. So in either of these cases, whether it's with bonds or with loans, some information is given, it's very transparent, some information you have to calculate. It really just depends for your needs, whether you want that very transparent thing to be the monthly payment or the interest rate. All right, thanks for watching.